Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and if your approaches look like what's happening on the left side of the screen right now, don't worry. Today we're going to break that down and figure out how to clean it up and turn it into a smooth landing like the one on the right. This video is a bit of a follow-up from a few months ago where we covered how to get yourself all the way to final and then land, so if you need a refresher on that, from traffic patterns to sight pictures and how approach lights work, definitely check it out first because we're going to be focused on the finer details of the last 1,000 feet down to the ground today. Before we can talk about things like the roundout and the flare though, I'm going to back it up just a tiny bit because there are two things you need to control to have a smooth landing: your airspeed and your descent rate. What you want to avoid is a high energy landing, so coming in too fast or too steep or both at the same time, and what we want is to get into a stabilized approach by 1,000 feet with a target airspeed and descent rate in mind. Let's start with our final approach speed, which you'll often hear referred to as VAP, and the way to calculate it is to multiply your full flap stall speed by 1.3, so basically you're adding 30% to that number. The full flap stall speed is always easy to figure out too because it's right where the white arc of the airspeed tape ends. So in the Bonanza here, that's going to be 62 knots, so we'll call it at 80 knots for our approach speed. The only exception to this is if there are wind gusts. In that case, you'll want to give yourself a bit more margin. So you typically add half the gust factor to your approach speed. So if there are 20 knot gusts, you would add 10 knots to your approach speed. We're going to look at how to achieve and maintain that speed in just a bit, but before we do, it's important to know that this isn't the speed you're going to cross the runway threshold or even land at. You'll typically want to be about 5 knots slower than your calculated approach speed as you cross the threshold, and you might hear this speed referred to as the VREF speed, so for us today that's going to be 75 knots. The other component to this, of course, is our descent rate, and there are two different formulas you can use for that, and which one you use really just depends on what's easier for you. The first way is to take your ground speed, multiply it by 5, and that'll give you the descent rate in feet per minute that you should be using on final. I prefer to do it another way though, but it comes out to the same result. So what you do is divide your ground speed by 2 and then add a 0 to it. So if our ground speed is 70 knots divided by 2, that's going to be 35. So our descent rate is going to be 350 feet per minute. Just be aware this is your ground speed that you need to use, not the indicated airspeed. And the easiest way to find it is to have a look on the GPS that you have on board. Exactly where the ground speed is displayed depends on which GPS you have in your plane, but it's always there somewhere and you're looking for the letters GS for ground speed. The calculation we just did is our ideal glide path, and it's really our starting point in perfect conditions. But as we know, conditions are very rarely perfect, so you have to be ready to adapt and adjust relative to what the sight picture, the landing lights, and everything else is telling you. One thing that might surprise you though is which controls to use if you're off speed or off path, and while it definitely feels more intuitive to use power to control your airspeed and pitch to control your descent rate, in a GA plane like this one it's actually more common to do the opposite and use power to manage the descent rate and pitch to control airspeed. Let's look at a specific scenario to see what I mean by that. We're at 1,000 feet right now, fully configured for the approach, so the gear is out and the flaps are at full, and we're about on our target speed of 80 knots, but we're lower than we should be. What we want to do based on what we just said is add a little bit of power to slow our descent rate down, and in most cases, just a tiny change is all it takes to correct it. I made the decision on this approach to add more power until I'd leveled off completely because we were a fair bit lower than we should have been, but if you're only just a little bit below glide path, you could keep descending, but just at a slower rate than the ideal one that you calculated. What's really interesting though is that using the power to change our descent rate hasn't resulted in a change in airspeed because like we were saying earlier, power controls your descent rate and pitch controls your airspeed. How long you have to keep your new power setting is going to depend on how far off path you are, but once you see the approach lights switch back to red and white and it's a normal sight picture that you're looking at for your approach, you can start to reduce power again to get back to your normal descent rate. This next situation is similar but the opposite of what we just looked at. So this time we're high on the approach, which you can tell by looking at the approach lights, which are both white at the moment. Our speed, on the other hand, is right where it should be. So the only change I'm going to make is to reduce power to increase our vertical speed. And I won't change the pitch or the trim because we don't need to make an airspeed change. Power changes can sometimes take a second or two to start taking effect though. So if you want to immediately start descending, you can give it just a bit of a push on the yoke to get going. Learning how much of a power adjustment you need to make comes with practice and experience, but for the most part, you don't want to make large power changes because it's easy to end up having to undo it a few seconds later. A good place to start is to keep in mind your ideal glide path that you calculated and add somewhere between 200 to 400 more feet per minute to it until you've caught up to the glide path, which is why we're descending at 800 feet per minute right now. It's going to take another few seconds before we catch up to our glide path here, but once you do, you just add some power back in to go back to your normal ideal descent rate, and again your airspeed is just going to stay the same. Let's look at a different situation. We're low again, just like in the first one, but we're coming in fast instead. We're well over 100 knots still, so we have some speed that we need to shed. We were saying earlier that pitch controls airspeed, so I'm going to start by pulling back on the controls a bit, which will have two consequences. First, our airspeed is going to start to bleed off, and it brings our descent rate under control as well. You probably noticed that I retrimmed the plane right after as well. Basically, anytime that you make a change in pitch, you always want to retrim so that you have little to no pressure on the controls. Now we still haven't lost enough speed. We're still above 100 knots, so I've reduced power a little bit now just because the combination that we have won't get us the speed that we want. What I find is that when you need to make a change in speed, most of the time it's a combination of pitch followed by a change in power to get to the configuration that you want, whereas when it's just the descent rate that you need to adjust, most of the time power is going to be all you need to change. Now you might be wondering, what do you do if you're coming in high and fast? So let's have a look at that one now. Oftentimes this is going to be the result of not being configured for the approach yet. And for example, I didn't have the gear out yet, which is one of the first things you should do if you're fast because they add a lot of drag to help slow you down. The other part of it is your flaps. So long as you're in the white arc of the airspeed indicator, you can go to full flaps, which again adds more drag. I reduced power pretty aggressively here because we needed to bleed altitude and airspeed, but I've actually reduced it too much because we want to maintain around 800 feet per minute. So I've added a touch back and I'm retrimming the plane to hold this new pitch. It looks like this configuration is going to give us the 80 knot airspeed that we wanted, so now it's really just a matter of catching up to our glide path. So if we needed to descend even faster or to slow that down, it would really just be a matter of changing our power setting. I know I've been a little bit repetitive here, but I really wanted to emphasize how spending time understanding pitch and power and how they work together helps you not just on approach like this, but in every phase of flight. Now that we know how to get stable on the approach, we can transition to looking at the finer details of getting the plane on the ground as we come across the runway threshold. We spent a lot of time talking about airspeed earlier in the video, and this is really where it pays off to be on speed, because without proper control, it's easy to end up floating above the runway because you're going too fast. It also helps to have an aiming point on the runway, so if you're landing on a bigger runway with markings like this one, you'd want to aim to touch down right on the 1,000-foot markers, which are the thicker white lines. The thing is though, if you plan on landing on that spot, you actually need to aim just a bit before that, because inevitably it takes time for the plane to settle down over the runway. As we're crossing the threshold, we reduce power slightly and maintain the pitch as is, which will have the effect of slowing us down to our threshold speed. You then start the round out when you're just a few feet above the ground by pulling back on the controls until we're pretty much at wings level, and then continue pulling the power out slowly. With that pitch, your mains are going to touch down first, and the nose should settle down right after that. Let's look at this from the side view now, because there's a little bit more I want to point out, and I think it'll help to understand the mechanics of it a bit better. This is the exact same approach we just looked at, and although our nose isn't pointing straight down, we're still descending as we know, but our front and rear landing gear are kind of level with each other right now. If we were to land like this, there's a chance that we'd impact on the nose gear first, so that's why as we get close to the ground, we start pulling back on the controls to get back to level flight. That puts us in a pitch up attitude with our main wheels in position to impact the ground first, and once we're over our landing spot, we continue pulling more power out, and that's going to put the plane down on the ground where we want it. What we're trying to do is fly the plane all the way to the ground. You want it to be an intentional action to touch down, rather than it just being the result of running out of air beneath you. When you're just getting started though, it's really hard to get a feel for what the round out should look like because you spend so little time in that attitude. Luckily there is an easy way to practice for it, and what you want to do is fly a normal approach, and then as you get into position over the runway, instead of pulling the power out to touch down, you hold that attitude with the plane level to the ground, and you practice adding just the right amount of power to stay airborne. This is a great way to learn where that sweet spot is of staying airborne versus touching down, and it really helps you to understand how those last few feet before touchdown work. You'll want to do this on a long enough runway so that you could do it for an extended period of time, and once you get near the end of the runway, you can either touch down and land, or start a go around and have another try at it. With all of those little details sorted and understood though, you should have all you need to nail your landings from now on, so if you learned something useful today, hit like and subscribe for more content like this one.